I'm Melissa Chartrand. I'm joined by musician Lynn Goucher. It's wonderful to have you here this morning, Lynn.
Thank you, Melissa. It's good to be here.
It is good to have you here. You live in our wonderful village of Cotuit.
Yes, I do.
And I'm so excited to share with our viewers your story because you were trained as a classic violinist and now have segued into being a jazz violinist, which is quite a change. And I have to say, from not being a musician, I would think that would be such an easy shift. And in talking with you and reading about you, it really isn't. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But then you completely left music to be a lawyer for several years.
I did.
And then return back to your roots. And we can go back to when you first were inspired. What's interesting to me, I took piano lessons as a kid, and even though I so wanted to play the piano, I hated lessons. And so let's begin there because you were quite the opposite.
I was. Well, I was fortunate to have a great teacher, a student, Joyce Alpern, who studied at New England Conservatory. She was like a big sister to me. So it was a joy to go to my lessons. And she helped me with so much, just my confidence and any family issues that arose, and there were quite a few of them, and it just how to play the violin well.
Well, you talked a little bit about how you started in the third grade and that even gave up your Saturdays or as far as you had to work with your father, yes. But you got up extra early so that you could have the time to take the lesson and then work yes. later. And that pattern continued as you would describe later on as well.
Yes, my father was the world's hardest worker. And I had to go with him on the delivery truck every Saturday. I'd get up at 4 in the morning and go to deliver until my lesson in Boston at 9. And then I worked the rest of the day with him. And in exchange for my free labor, I got my violin lesson at New England Conservatory every Saturday.
How wonderful. And then in high school, let's talk a little bit how it progressed. So you stayed with the violin, because you did yes. dabble with piano as well, but was that much later on?
No, actually, piano was my first instrument, but we didn't own a piano, so I really couldn't do much with it. But my very first music teacher, was a pianist, an elderly woman in my neighborhood who actually she played for silent movies.
Really?
So, yeah, she was quite a character.
And you learned a lot from her?
I was entertained a lot by her.
Well. But then went towards the violin. Yes. And then in high school, some amazing accolades, all-state orchestra, and all sorts of experiences there. Let's talk a little bit about that.
Yes. Well, I started in the Milford Public School system in third grade and with everyone else, and I was plugging along, but I really wasn't that advanced. We didn't have a violin teacher, for one thing. We were being taught by a trumpet player or a cellist. And then when I met Joyce at New England, she just brought it home for me. Finally, I had a violin teacher, and I just took off. My technique improved. I had learned confidence from her, performance skills, and she began recommending me to join the Greater Boston Youth Symphony, to try out for All-State, and things just happened to fall in my lap. So I was able to do that. I was an All-State for 2 years and Central District for 6 years, and then I was the first from Milford, and I believe the only, to make it to All-Eastern United States.
What an honor.
Yeah, that was a real honor. I didn't even know it existed until I was chosen for it.
And then did you stay, when did you decide to leave, because you played professionally?
I did.
For a few years, but then ended up heading to law school.
I did. I played professionally with the Central Mass Symphony for about 5 or 6 years. I can't even remember. And I was a member of the Worcester Music Union. And then I started to get bored with symphony playing. It was pretty much the same repertoire over and over, and I felt like I was on autopilot a lot of times. And I just started to move away from it. And there were a lot of lawyers in my family, and I always had an interest in that. So I just went off to law school just to try a different path.
And then, but you've come back.
I have, and I found it's not so uncommon. Bart Weissman, for instance,
yes.
who's a mentor of mine, he was in the Air Force as a musician, played at the White House, and then went off for about 20 years and was in the high-tech industry, and now he's back playing music again.
And so when you say you were a little bored with, the symphony playing and why you got away from that in classical, now that you've returned, because that is important to still have that passion, which you very much have, and now the transition, let's talk a little bit about how you've gone from classical to jazz.
Okay. Well, I always had an interest in it from a young child. My parents listened to big band. It was their era. Luckily, I was the youngest of a large Irish Catholic family, so my father was in World War II, so the big band sound was their thing. And I heard it growing up, and I loved jazz, but I just never thought I could play it. And classical violin is so the opposite kind of training. You don't learn how to improvise. You don't even pay that much attention to music theory as much as you do the technique of playing the violin. So it was very difficult to make that transition. I was, what I always said, was a slave to the page. I needed written music. The thought of just going on stage without music in front of me and improvising and having a good time was just completely foreign. It was something other people did. But little by little, people encouraged me, and I thought, well, maybe I can do this.
Let's talk about the person that you met with that gave you a lesson that doesn't give lessons, because it sounded a little bit of a turning point for you to face your fears and get over it.
It was a huge turning point.
Work through it, I should say.
Well, in the jazz world, pianists and guitar players have the upper hand because they're used to playing chords and thinking harmonically. Whereas melody instruments like violin, it's very difficult to get into that kind of mode. So I was struggling because I played violin so well. People were inviting me to play with them, but I didn't understand their lingo. I didn't understand how they talked or approached the music. So finally, I was desperate, and I reached out to Mimi Rabson, who's a professor at Berkeley, and she's a jazz violinist, and I just said, listen, I know you don't take students, but can I just, have one lesson, and because I'm lost. So she agreed, and I drove into Arlington. We actually met in her garage. I didn't even get to go in her house. And after about an hour, she had me improvising.
Wow.
And she said, look, I totally get it. This is what they're talking about. This is what they expect you to do, and this is what you should be doing. And after that, it was like the light dawned.
That's wonderful. Yeah. And you've talked about, we mentioned Bart, is a great friend of mine and phenomenal musician, and he loves the relationships and collaborations with all the different musicians. So let's end with, because I'm sure our viewers are going to want to come and hear you play, that you've been sitting in different places at the Grand Cru where they play. Tell me a little bit about that, the different places you play, and how it is picking up with these different musicians.
Well, the Cape is phenomenal, first of all, because we have so many great musicians, particularly jazz musicians, and they're pretty nice people. Larry Chaplin had recommended me for a solo gig at the Roadhouse Cafe on Valentine's Day. I was their strolling violinist, and I had taken a class at Cape Cod Conservatory with Bart Weissman over the winter. And one day I just happened to email him, and I noticed he was playing at the Island Merchant with Livio Freitas, Brazilian jazz. And I said, oh, I can't wait to see that tonight. And he said, bring your fiddle. I was, what? I sat in for 3 hours. I just improvised the whole night. So then he started to invite me. We went to see him at the Grand Cru a couple of weeks ago, or a month ago. He was playing with Pamela Hines, who's a jazz pianist, a really great jazz pianist. And we were just sitting there watching, and he came over and said, did you bring your fiddle? I said, no, of course not. I'm here as a spectator. I said, well, go home and get it. It's just down the road. So I did. I sat in for 5 tunes and had a ball.
Wow.
And ever since then, I've been getting these invitations.
Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah. So I'll be playing at the Grand Cru June 28th, sitting in with Jerry Bowden, and I'll be playing at the Riverway.
Great. Well, this is wonderful. It's been so nice to chat with you and learn a little bit about you. And for our viewers interested, certainly they can contact us here at online at highartsdistrict.com. There's an email that I can pass along information, and you can also find Lynn on Facebook.
Yes. Thank you,
Melissa. So for Lynn Goucher, I'm Melissa Chartrand, wishing you an artful day.
Thank you.